For more on this week's global campaign to combat climate change, I want to bring in one of the world's first so-called global warming warriors. He wrote The End of Nature back in 1989. Today, he runs 350.org, a group that organized the marches this past Sunday, which brought hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets of New York and in capitals around the world. In fact, he tells me in more than 170 cities worldwide, 2,600 marches. Very impressive, Bill McKibben. Good morning and welcome to In the Loop.
Good to be with you.
So the point, given the enormous scale of these marches, explain to us why it is you feel that we are finally at a tipping point here.
Well, I hope we're at a tipping point. We've known for 25 years more or less what's going on, but the power of the fossil fuel industry has been great enough so far to prevent action. What's finally happening is, I think, people catching on to that and building the only kind of movement that can stand up to that barrage of cash that the oil industry can throw at this problem. We don't have that kind of money, but we have a lot of bodies, and an awful lot of them were in New York and in a lot of other places last weekend.
On Sunday evening, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the heirs to the Standard Oil fortune, announced that they would be divesting their investments in fossil fuels. How big of an impact will that have?
I'd say that's a pretty big impact. This is the original fossil fuel fortune, the greatest oil fortune there ever was. If its heirs think it's not only unwise but immoral to invest in fossil fuels, what excuse do the rest of us have? This divestment campaign that they're now a part of has spread around the world. A study from Oxford last year found it was the fastest growing such campaign in history. And it's really powerful to see how many governments, how many universities, how many church denominations. This summer, the World Council of Churches, representing 580 million Christians, said, we're no longer going to participate in investing in fossil fuel.
And the diversity of the people who turned out on the streets for these climate protests over the weekend, that was really remarkable. It wasn't just sort of the usual suspects of activists. It was Ban Ki-moon, it was Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York. There were celebrities, there were business people.
And there were enormous numbers of people from frontline communities who have already felt the impacts of climate change. This was powerful testimony.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on what the role is of business here, because after all, this is Bloomberg TV. Ban Ki-moon, who was among the protesters, pointed to an announcement from BlackRock, the world's largest money manager, which joined 346 institutional investors managing $24 trillion in assets to call for a price on carbon emissions and a climate agreement to help shift economies away from fossil fuels. How much impact will that have?
That'll help. The rest of the business community has tended to leave this issue to the fossil fuel guys, and they, of course, have a huge interest in making sure we never change. But now the financial industry in particular is beginning to understand that they're facing a carbon bubble that makes the housing bubble look small, that the stranded assets beneath the ground in oil, coal, and gas reserves, should we ever take global warming seriously, represent a huge, huge, huge risk to investors, and the wise ones are beginning to back away.
I like that, a carbon bubble that makes the housing bubble look small. You also wrote an article in Rolling Stone recently, a so-called call to arms, and in it you wrote that since President Obama took office, summer sea ice in the Arctic has mostly disappeared. The process of massive melt is now fully underway. Seawater is 30% more acidic than just 4 decades ago, and the creatures at the bottom of the ocean, of course, are feeling the brunt of that. And California, one of the biggest states in the country, caught in a drought deeper than any time since Europeans arrived. What kind of marks do you give President Obama for his climate policies? Because on the one hand, yes, he's imposed new tighter restrictions on emission standards for cars, but on the other hand, he's also expanded the amount of territory we can dig for fossil fuels in.
That's right. In his time, the U.S. has passed the Russians and the Saudis as the biggest oil and gas producer in the world. You can't have this both ways. If you're serious about slowing down global warming, then you have to stop digging up more fossil fuel. You know, President Obama's done more than George Bush, but then, you know, I've drunk more beer than my 14-year-old niece, too, so, you know.
Fair enough. At this point, it does seem like most of the scientific community is together with the reality, the thesis that human activity is warming the planet. The question now is whether humans are warming it in a way that is substantially different from natural variables in what's going on in the climate.
This is an entirely new thing that we're doing here. The climate has changed over deep time in the past, but in this case we know why it's happening. We're digging up hundreds of millions of years worth of biology and burning it in the space of 50 years, and it's having the biggest effect that anything humans have ever done.